If history is written by the winners, what are some of the loser stories that we should know of? Cleopatra. Daughter Cleopatra Selene won in her own way after being raised a hostage by her mother's worst enemies. An adolescence in which all three of her brothers died, and she was the only child to live to adulthood. She married King Juba of Mauritius, I think it's Mauritius, and it's said they ruled as equals. Her face was on the other side of coinage from his. Accounts say she was better at ruling in general, because he was a bookworm who liked studying more than being king. So she'd do the duties he didn't want to, but they absolutely worked together. It's heavily believed they married for love. Or at least if they didn't, lucked out and fell in love anyway. Which of course was fairly rare back then. After she died he remarried. But when he died, he was buried with her instead of with his second wife, who I believe was buried separately. The book Cleopatra's Moon is a great historical fiction novel about her by Vicky Alvia Schechter. I never even knew Cleopatra had a daughter until I read that book, let alone that she was a queen in adulthood as well. A forgotten survivor of history who experienced so much loss in her youth and still found love and happiness in adulthood. I think it's too human a story for us to allow it to be forgotten. Around 1955, the year a president of the US died of an heart attack, President Eisenhower suffered an heart attack. Surviving it, there were documentations of increasing heart diseases in the country. Ancel Keys at this point came swooping in, claiming, through very faulty and selective research, that the consumption of fat was the reason for the aforementioned increase. The non-victor of this story, John Yudkin, was researching the same subject as Keys, and found that the exponential increase in sugar consumption was the actual reason for heart failings. He had great research points and proof, but Keys at this point was too popular or even made the cover of Time, and dismissed his science, ridiculizing him publicly. Yudkin made multiple attempts to prove that his science was correct, but he ultimately died in anonymity or very nearly. Just a slight correction here. While President Eisenhower did have a heart attack in 1955, he didn't die from it. He lived until 1969. Link. This is pretty niche, but I just finished rereading Voices of Our Elders about the Huaht people on the west coast of Canada. It includes oral history of the people along with origin stories and other important stories, and was a collaboration between members of the nation and a historian. It was fascinating to read a really gripping history of an incredibly resilient people. It makes me want to read more histories of indigenous people in North America, written by them. I feel like I've missed out on important parts of my Canadian history, as if it started with colonization. Reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend online, who was telling me about their country's myths and legends. When they finished, I pointed out North America, specifically US in my case. But it works for just now doesn't really have any myths like that. Mostly because the original settlers and people kinda killed all of it. Makes me sad, to be honest. Even if I don't believe it, I do enjoy hearing about and reading myths of places. And it would have been cool to see North America's. But most of it is gone, and we nowadays can't do much about the past. Every story of every country that has somehow been ducked over by England, France and Spain too. But there's a reason I'm writing this in English. I mean that France and Spain have ducked over a lot of countries too. Not that they got ducked over by the English. The Spanish Civil War. John Brown. The story of Islam in the Middle Ages. Life in the Americas before Columbus. There's a great book called 1491 that discusses life in the Americas before Columbus. Highly recommend it. The Biscary Massacre. During WWII, a U.S. company captured some Italian soldiers. An American sergeant lined up the prisoners and mowed them all down with a machine gun. The People's Republic of Korea Link established as an independent provisional government at the liberation of Korea from Japan in 1945. They were non-communists who had the goal of establishing a democratic government with various social reforms to hasten the reconstruction of Korea, and vowed to fight any outside power that hindered their actions. They were denounced as communists by the Americans who wanted to seat their own puppet dictator, Lee Sung-man. Their leader was assassinated, and their remaining followers were massacred on Jeju Island by the Republic of Korea in 1948. A lot of Philippine revolutionary heroes aren't household names, because after the Spanish were booted out by the Americans, who then decided to colonize the country instead of giving us independence. The guerrillas who refused to concede were labeled bandits and outlaws, and weren't given the historical recognition they deserved. I live in Chicago, where there are so few Native Americans. I can count on one hand all that I have met in my life here. I started traveling by car to the western states a few years ago, and have stopped and passed through a lot of native towns, reservations, historical sites. I know it sounds like a total white person glitch, but it's eye-opening to learn about their past and current struggles and their histories. It's kind of cringy when people should know some native history do not know. For instance, I took a tour of the Wind Cave in SD. I asked the tour guide what the Lakota's take on the Wind Cave was. She said I'm not even sure they knew it was here, which I thought couldn't be right. With people crisscrossing across this area for millennia, they surely came across it. One of the best places to learn about the Lakota is the Lakota Museum in SD. I very highly recommend it. I learned there, for instance, that the Wind Cave has a whole mythology connected with it. You have to visit Cahokia Link by Street Louis. It was a kingdom with outposts as far as Madison, Wisconsin. It is a World Heritage Site link. The majority of the tourists are from outside the US. Unless you are from St. Louis or study archaeology, you would never know about it. What colonizers all of them did when they arrived in Asia, America and Africa. King Leopold was particularly nasty, even among those guys. During the Revolutionary War in America, Britain freed any black slaves that were willing to join them against the Americans. After the war they kept their promise, with many freed blacks going to England due to the fact that lives for them got much harder in America, especially in the South, because that's where most of the slaves rebelled from. That was the start of why Southern slaves had it so bad before the Civil War. Bangladesh Liberation War Massacre. During the 9-month-long Bangladesh War for Liberation, members of the Pakistani military and supporting pro-Pakistani Islamist militias from Jamaat-e-Islami Party 7 killed between 200,000 and 3,148 people and raped between 200,000 and 400,000 Bengali women. 8-9 according to Bangladeshi and Indian sources. 10 in a systematic campaign of genocidal rape. 11-12 the actions against women were supported by Jamaat-e-Islami religious leaders, who declared that Bengali women were Ghanimot-e Bengali for public property. 13 as a result of the conflict, a further 8 to 10 million people, mostly Hindus, 14 fled the country to seek refuge in neighboring India. It is estimated that up to 30 million civilians were internally displaced, 8 out of 70 million. Even though Bangladesh won by India's support and help from USSR, history was written by America, so we don't know much about it. Source link. Winston Churchill is apparently celebrated as some kind of hero in the UK, but those of us in India know him best for having created famines by diverting resources from starving Indians to act as reserve stockpiles for their military. He also played a part in what were essentially concentration camps in Africa. Hundreds of thousands died in there because he believed the white man was superior. I'm British and it's ridiculous how many people still think he was a wonderful man. Yeah. He helped get us through WWII with some inspirational speeches and all that. But the stuff he did and was a part of before then is nothing but monstrous in my opinion. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn has a ton of these stories. Well worth checking out if you're really interested in that side of history. The Germans captured almost the entire Norwegian whaling fleet in Antarctica in WWII without a single shot being fired. The name of that raider was actually Penguin. Basically anything about SMS Emden in World War I. A light cruiser caught far away from home. She was a strange mixture of gallantry and boldness. Like she entered the harbor of Penning and sank a superior Russian cruiser which wasn't prepared at all. 3 of the losses on board were prostitutes. On her way out she sank a French destroyer and realized many survivors would die without medical assistance. So she stopped the next freighter and transferred the French to it on the condition they would be brought to the next hospital. Emden was surprised by a superior Australian cruiser when she destroyed a radio station. The parts of the crew tasked with destroying the radio station couldn't return to Emden in time, so they used the old, leaking, sabotaged and half-rotten schooner Ayrshire. Once they realized Emden was lost, Ayrshire escaped, and after a long odyssey the crew returned home. Every surviving Emden crew member was allowed to add Emden to their surname. And as of today every German warship of that name carries an iron cross at the conning tower. The Germans had a dreadnought and a light cruiser SMS Goeben and SMS Breslau in the Mediterranean when World War I started. They didn't want to be trapped in the Adriatic Sea and escaped to Istanbul. Turkey was neutral at that time, and German warships couldn't stay there for long. So they were officially sold to Turkey on the spot. The crew remained on board. This action likely led to Turkey joining the war on the German side, not on the Allied side. And at last World War I, the Germans used a sailing ship, SMS Seidler, a former British pass of Bamaha, as a merchant raider in 1917. As the Germans didn't have any places to refuel coal by then, they hoped that a sailing ship could operate far longer. As there was no way to escape, the disguise was more important. So a sailing ship looked innocent, as nobody seriously expected a warship that late. Breaking through the blockade at the Strait of Denmark, she was actually intercepted and checked by a British ship, including a boarding party. The disguise worked so well that they let her continue. All crew members who couldn't speak Norwegian hid behind secret doors. Also, this helped the disguise, as a normal sailing ship didn't need so many crew members, so a big crew would have risen suspicion already. She was lost on a reef later on, but given the investment and the number of captured sunk ships, it was a big success. Sorry, but this is going to be a long one. In short, Tito killed many Nazis to gain Allied support, but got many more of his own people killed as a result. Mihailovich committed sabotage against the Nazis and worked to save people, both his own people and Allied fighters, rather than make a show of fighting without regard for the innocents that died. This tempered and humanist approach saw him charged with treason and executed by his political opponent. I discovered this in a book called The Forgotten 500, the tale of downed Allied airmen in Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia in World War II. The story itself is amazing, and I highly recommend it, but it will make you despise the State Department for suppressing it. The relevant part here is the power struggle within Yugoslavia itself, between monarchist Draza Mihailovich and communist Josip Broz Tito. This isn't about communism bad or good. This is about a man abandoned by the people he saved and unjustly executed by his political opponent. A brief context: both men led Yugoslavian resistance efforts against the Nazis in World War II. Mihailovich was more subtle. In order to avoid the Nazis' typical murder a village to avenge a murdered patrol tactics, he chose to sabotage equipment using subtle methods that prevented anyone pinning the blame on local sabotage. But it also meant that the Allies didn't have a clear picture of what should have been a valued ally. In comparison, Tito was throwing bodies at the problem like there was no tomorrow, following the Russian lead in that regard. This led to the Allies supporting Tito and his violent resistance. The two groups absolutely would not work together. Often they fought each other rather than pursue Nazis. This forced the Allies to pick a side, lest they arm two groups against the Nazis, only to see it wasted on internal battles. They were on opposite ends of the country by the time the events of the Forgotten 500 occurred. The loser story: Mihailovich gathered 512 down at airmen, mostly bomber crews and escort pilots, in the mountains, where he was based. In working with the OSS, they constructed a makeshift landing strip without tools, and without alerting the Germans, which would endanger the villagers who saved them, in order to land C-47 cargo planes that would have to get in and out without being detected by Nazis again. It would doom the villagers. The OSS sent cargo planes to get them, but failed to provide substantial support or even a form of repayment to the people that made it happen. Weapons and resources were largely provided to the communist Tito, who inevitably won. Had Mihailovich executed on charges of treason despite Tito getting many innocent people killed as a result of his actions? We should always talk about the atrocities committed in the name of victory. Part of me thinks that, if everyone understood the full cost of victory in past wars, it would make avoiding them more desirable. For example, there are countless stories about how awful the Soviet troops were to Germans while pushing towards Berlin towards the end of the war, including civilians. Yet we don't hear about any sort of punishment doled out for those crimes. Sarcasm: anything for the war effort. Gotta keep the troops happy. Sarcasm. War never changes, but we also never hear both sides of the story. World War I is often regarded as the seminal tragedy of the 20th century. I say WWII is the moment we lost our humanity entirely. The Armenian Genocide. The Trail of Tears. Wounded Knee. If you live in the American South, history is actually written by the losers. LOL. The Tushkaku class aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy during WWII. Despite not having the fame of their predecessors for not being sunk during the Battle of Midway, they were among the best carriers of the war in terms of both design and performance, and by far the best Japanese carriers, and proved to be formidable opponents up until their sinkings in 1944. The younger ship, Zukaku, is especially interesting to me, but both had very successful and intriguing careers. I once learned that, while history is written by the winners, the songs are written by the losers.